Buongiorno. Good afternoon, persons of quality. Welcome to a presentation in the Aquinas Lecture Series. Our presenter today is Professor Gary Eberle of the English Department. He's currently Master of the Revels for Aquinas College's 125th anniversary. So he's been responsible for coordinating celebratory events all this year, and he produced this book about the history of Aquinas College, which I understand is on sale in the bookstore, just so you know that. This is Gary's 29th year at Aquinas College. As an author and teacher, his main interests have been in the spiritual traditions of the world, including comparative mythology and comparative religions. He's the author of 7 books, 3 of which deal explicitly with the spiritual condition of the modern world. These include The Geography of Nowhere, Finding Oneself in the Postmodern World, Sacred Time and the Search for Meaning, and most recently, this book, Dangerous Words, Talking About God in an Age of Fundamentalism. Sacred Time and Search for Meaning won an award from Spirituality and Health magazine as one of the best books on spirituality for 2003. The reviewer said Sacred Time is a philosophically rich work that reveals avenues for finding balance in your life between the temporal and the eternal. In his fiction, as well as his nonfiction, Eberle has been concerned with the spiritual condition of the contemporary world. Publishers Weekly, in review of his 1995 satirical novel Angel Strings, called it a dead-on spiritual rendering of the American landscape. So please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Professor Gary Eberle.
Thank you. I have a couple of other things to do here. First of all, that's me, to announce a couple of things. We have free t-shirts in the back with the word study on them. We're celebrating the charism of study this week. One to a customer, but please grab one on the way out. They have been paid for, as all of our 125th events are, by our generous underwriting sponsors. The events coming up this week include my talk today. Tomorrow at 12:30, the writer Scott Turow for an on-campus free presentation. Monday, March 19th, Sister Barbara Reed and George Weigel on April 11th. I'm sorry that's scrolling so fast. And One Enchanted Evening will be our finale with a wonderful concert by Sarah Jakubiak and Andy Fleeser, and it will be a marvelous evening of entertainment and food to wrap up the 125th anniversary. The second thing I would like to announce is that, thank the underwriters, t-shirts, okay, plug the other talks. And now the disclaimer. What I'm going to be talking about in the next 45 minutes, and the way I'm talking about it, simply represents my opinion, my thoughts on this topic. It's in no way, I don't think, represents an official statement on the part of the college, and it certainly is nothing official on the part of the church. And that will become clear as I go through these comments. I just wanted to put that up front. This is me talking. And next Monday, Sister Barbara Reed will talk on the Catholic intellectual tradition from her perspective. She's a feminist New Testament scholar who's written several books on the New Testament scripture, as well as edited a 60-volume amazing scholarly compendium of feminist criticism of literature. She's an Aquinas grad, both in her BA and her MA from the old AIRS program, and then PhD from Catholic University of America. On April 11th, the theologian George Weigel, who's with the Institute for Policy and Ethics in Washington, D.C., will present a talk on Ex Corde Ecclesiae and its relation to Catholic colleges and universities, which I'll be touching on today. And I think it's fair to assume that George Weigel and I will present different points of view if you know his work. So here we are. We rather reflexively describe Aquinas College as what? A small Catholic liberal arts college, right? Small part, no problem with that word. Liberal arts, not much argument about that word. But in the middle of all of that is the word Catholic, which I think is proving to be a troublesome word, like the ones that I discussed in Dangerous Words a couple of years ago. The question of the Catholicity of Aquinas College, I think, is becoming more crucial than it ever has been in the college's history in a lot of ways. As I worked on the book, Aquinas College, the first 125 years, it became clear to me that the Catholicity of Aquinas College is not really a fixed identity. It's a fluid thing that's changed from decade to decade as the church itself and Catholicism have changed. In fact, I'd say that prior to the past 30 years, the mission and the Catholic identity of the college were implicit and very clear. When the faculty was composed of 90% or more Dominican sisters and priests, and the diocesan priest, Father Bukowski, was the president, and the remaining lay faculty and staff were almost completely Roman Catholic lay people, there was an implicit understanding of what it meant to be a small Catholic liberal arts college. And even after Vatican II, during President Ruby's years, from 1969 till 86, I think Aquinas' Catholicism was in line with the progressive liberal ecumenical aggiornamento of the post-Vatican II years. So that when I arrived in 1982, the Catholicism of the college was characterized by inclusiveness, by expansiveness, and a willingness to embrace ecumenical and interfaith dialogue. Today, almost 30 years later, we find ourselves, I think, at a different historical moment. We're in an age of contraction, and I don't think anyone would deny that under the leadership of Rome, the Catholic Church has been involved in a kind of retrenchment in the last couple of decades, which has re-emphasized the hierarchical authority and the orthodoxy of the Church. And in addition, among large portions of Catholic laity, there's a kind of nostalgia for the pre-Vatican II Church, an idyllic pre-Vatican II Church that may or may not have existed. Those of us who lived through that Vatican II transition have real memories of the pre-Vatican II Church. So, and part of the current movement was then Pope John Paul II's encyclical Excordia Ecclesiae in 1991, which challenged colleges and universities that are going to call themselves Catholic to possess certain characteristics that put them squarely in the Catholic intellectual tradition. And then in 2001, just a little over 10 years ago, the National Council of Catholic Bishops put forth guidelines for American Catholic institutions of higher education to implement Excordia Ecclesiae. Now, here at Aquinas, we've been facing our own version of that larger movement within society and within the church. The college, by any statistical measures, is in many ways less Catholic than it has been, and certainly than it was in the 1950s. For the past 10 years, the number of incoming freshmen who've self-identified as being Catholic has been just over 50%. So almost half and half of our incoming students for the last 10 years have said Catholic, not Catholic, or not answered. Because we have a long-standing policy of not asking faculty, staff, and administrators at the time of hire what their religious practice is, with the exception of the president, we really don't know how many of our staff are members and practicing Catholics. But another issue is, with the recent and the coming retirement of a couple of the Dominican sisters, we will be left, by my count, with 4 Dominicans on our staff. So, one of the points that I'd like to address this afternoon is what does the Catholicity of Aquinas mean when, by all these statistical measures, it seems to be less Catholic than it has been in the past? And that leads to a whole lot of other questions. I mean, I've just kept spinning these off, right? For example, what will the mission of Aquinas be? What is the Dominican mission after Dominicans are no longer physically present on the staff? What will remain distinctively Catholic about Aquinas College in the future? What will continue to distinguish us from secular schools or from other church-affiliated liberal arts colleges? And in what context will the liberal arts exist if they don't exist within the Catholic Christian humanist tradition? Will Aquinas College, now I'm just letting my mind wander, but will we ever disaffiliate from the Catholic Church the way that some Protestant colleges or colleges begun by Protestant denominations disaffiliated, like Kalamazoo College, originally a Baptist school, or Oberlin or Albion, originally a Methodist school, now no longer church-affiliated? And if that happens, how would Aquinas be different from an Oberlin or a K college? Another thing I'd like to address today is what the Catholic intellectual tradition can mean on a campus to the non-Catholics or former Catholics or to fundamentalist humanist rationalists or to skeptics and even atheists who might be on our staff and faculty or in our student body. That is, why do I believe that Aquinas College needs to stay within the Catholic intellectual tradition even after the literal Dominican presence disappears, and even if the majority of our faculty, students, and staff are someday not Catholic or even not of any religious affiliation? So can we have a Catholic college and a Catholic worldview without, strictly speaking, being Catholic? All right, so I'm going to provokingly say, yeah, I think we can. And one way I'd like to approach it is partly through autobiography, which explains the subtitle of this talk, which is My 60 Years in and Around the Catholic Intellectual Tradition. Because what I want to talk about is what I call a Catholic habit of mind, which I believe can exist even if you question or don't practice Catholicism. Now, before traditional Catholics start stacking wood for the bonfire, hear me out. All right. Continue to be, that is, I was born a cradle Catholic. You all know what that term means. I believe I took Catholicism in from the amniotic fluid. And I never in my life remember a time when, including now in the last 30 years, when I've not been living in a world full of priests and nuns with weekly or even daily Mass and theological discussions in the Catholic tradition. So Catholicism, in that sense, is in my DNA. But I no longer think of myself as being Catholic, because as I've gotten older, it seems to me my being, whatever that is not identified with belonging to any particular religious affiliation, but somehow transcends or goes beyond that. But I would say even after all these years and the distance I've come since I was baptized at the age of 0, I continue to think Catholic and to speak Catholic. And I have a Protestant minister friend who says, boy, if we just scratch you a little bit, Rome is in there. And I don't deny it. Okay. I think the way that I look at and engage the world is even when I'm chanting in a Buddhist temple or when I'm singing Protestant hymns, it's a way that I recognize as Catholic. So for me, Catholicism has left a legacy of trying to live in the world in a particular way and to engage the world in a particular manner that I think is different in what I call its feeling tone than the way that my Protestant and Buddhist and Jewish friends live. And it's that particular charism or gift of the Spirit that represents the distinctive quality of a place like Aquinas, and that I'm going to try to define and talk about a bit today. So the 3 lectures that are happening in this theme, the Catholic intellectual tradition, the title presents a problem. What is a Catholic intellectual? Is it someone whose subject matter is Catholicism? So Dr. Duncan's dissertation was on the Catholics in New York State at the time of the American Revolution. Does that qualify him as a Catholic intellectual? On the other hand, is it someone who approaches his or her academic discipline from the point of view of Catholicism? Or is a Catholic intellectual someone who is both Catholic and an intellectual, but who keeps his or her professional discipline somehow separate from religious practice? Or is it, as I'm going to suggest, somebody who takes a particular stance towards the world and life and the mind, the life of the mind and the spirit, not seeing separation among those things, but seeing a connection, a completion. And I've been thinking about this for months, and the more I come back to it, I think that a mind that's formed by the Catholic intellectual tradition is going to be quite different from a mind that's formed by the yeshiva tradition in Judaism, or of, let's say, a cornerstone type university. And trying to articulate that is not easy, but I'm going to give it a try. Let's admit we live in a strange time, religiously speaking. I think what's happened in the last 20 years is that religious debate, dialogue, disputation in this country have become polarized by two competing fundamentalisms. Both of them are characterized by narrow literalism, and one is a religious fundamentalism, and the other is an atheistic one. And both of them are characterized by binary thinking, which says that faith and reason are in opposition to each other. We have faith or reason rather than faith and reason. So let's explore this problem a bit more. Religious fundamentalism, as I pointed out in Dangerous Words, and as if you really want the 20-volume version of this, Martin Marty and R. Scott Appleby's Fundamentalisms Observed is a brilliant accounting of modern fundamentalism that arose in the last 125 years as a specific response to the triumph of the scientific worldview that took place from about 1650 to 1850. Especially after Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859, intellectuals and religionists felt called upon to make an either-or choice, that you would either go the way of science and reason or you would go the way of religion. And the attempt of 19th century fundamentalists who were coming out of the Princeton Presbyterian Theologate and the Moody Bible Institute and other bastions of conservative Protestantism, they tried to lay down proof of the Bible's inaccuracy to provide a systematic, that is something like a scientific theology, and their goal was to provide an empirical basis for the factuality of the Bible that would have the same kind of validity and certitude as the claims of the scientists and biologists. If you want to believe the Bible literally, you have a real problem with what was coming out of geology and biology in the 1800s and the 20th century. So the religious fundamentalists attempt to take Scripture and then rationalize the 7 days of creation, go looking for Noah's Ark, and all of those other enterprises that would provide them with solid, substantial physical evidence of the Bible's truth. Now, needless to say, the latest incarnation of this is the Creation Museum outside Louisville, Kentucky, right off I-275, which uses the word museum as a kind of authority for biblical literalism and shows things like children playing with dinosaurs, which of course never happened, and that the world is no more than 5,000 some years old. So scientific reasoners laugh at this and think that therefore they should jettison all religion in favor of rational materialism, and groups like the Center for Free Inquiry and the so-called neo-atheists with Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Bill Maher's movie Religulous simply set up all religions and all believers as far-right Bible-thumping literalists who would stuff that interpretation of Scripture down everyone's throats and in our school system and supplant completely facts of hard evolutionary theory with superstition and irrational mythology. Now, we don't have time to undertake a full critique, but what I tried to point out is that both camps are fundamentalists, guilty of narrow, crabbed, and binary thinking. It's an either-or school of thought, and they resemble each other more than either of them would like to admit. They're both guilty of absolutism, and they're both guilty of the slippery slope fallacy, which says that if we admit, the religionists say, if we admit the truth claims of science, then, next step, our entire religious belief and value system collapses. And the scientists say if we for one moment entertain the superstition of religion, then what good is our scientific reasoning? And the rational basis of science collapses. Now, here's a problem on a college campus. Academics are rationalists. We are taught to be rational. We're taught to be logical. We are taught to take solid evidence for truth claims. We're taught to be wary of the soft truth claims of religion, and even, I think, to be somewhat ashamed of those things if we hold them. And when we hear that there's a board of trustees committee here on Catholic mission and identity, the radar go up, right? And they say, what's going to happen here? Are we going to be forced to reconcile our academic disciplines with the teaching of the Scripture, with the authority of the Catholic Church? Will we have to, on our web pages, as some colleges do, put how our disciplines and our curriculum are explicitly connected with the teaching of the Catholic Church? Will there be a Catholic geology, for example? When I bring this topic up in faculty conversations, I hear anxiety on both sides. Some people say, how dare we even think of mixing religion with our academic discipline? And on the other end, I hear, how dare we not think of mixing religion with our academic discipline? And once again, I'm hearing binary thinking and either or from both sides. So here's where I am as a product of over 20 years of formal Catholic education. I'm trying to say, whoa, wait a minute, it's not like that. So now I've got some time to try to explain it. The problem is that so much of the dialogue around this topic is being framed by the larger cultural conversation that we're having between the two fundamentalisms. So that even within the Catholic discussion, I'm hearing that kind of binary thinking that I'm also hearing from conservative, rigid Protestants and conservative, rigid, rational materialists. And what's missing is the Catholic point of view. So what is that? As I experienced it growing up and learned through grade school, high school, undergraduate and graduate school, and some other intense experiences in between, the Catholic tradition is a both-and tradition, not an either-or tradition. In the both-and tradition, it's quite possible to believe in the truth of Scripture and the scientific type of truth that we arrive at through experimentation and reason. To choose the most public example, Catholicism has never had a problem with holding evolution and its belief in Scripture, because as Pope Pius XII pointed out in Humani Generis in 1950, the, quote, "The teaching authority of the Church does not forbid that in conformity with the present state of human sciences and sacred theology research and discussions on the part of scientists or people experienced in both fields take place with regard to the doctrine of evolution, in as far as it inquires into the origins of the human body," my emphasis, "as coming from pre-existent and living matter. For the Catholic faith obliges us to hold that souls are immediately created by God." So, the point is, to parse it out a bit, evolution talks about the evolution of the physical body. The Church is concerned with the soul, the non-material. This division reflects the Catholic approach known as non-overlapping magisteria. A magisterium is an area of teaching. And in the issue of biological evolution, the fact of evolution and the description of how the process evolved over millennia is a question that should be left to the scientists, who are going to base that description of the process on material evidence. Now, to account for the special ontological status of the human being in creation, the Church maintains that at some point in that biological process, God infuses the human species with a soul. The soul is not the same thing as consciousness, much less the same thing as the physical brain, okay? It's a spiritual reality. It's simply not empirically provable. It's simply outside the domain of science to comment on. You simply cannot prove the existence of a soul. You accept it on faith. The question's not only impervious to reason, but reason here is just irrelevant. So, and I admit, okay, let's own the shadow. In spite of the terrors of the Inquisition, in spite of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Catholic tradition, at its best, encourages both faith and reason. And by the way, I saw a copy of the index from 1750 in an exhibit last week, with the famous exception of Galileo. Virtually all the titles in the index were not scientific books. They were books on theology and books of philosophy, and folks like Voltaire who completely reject God and so on. So it's not stopping the human intellect from exploring the area of teaching that is its rightful province, but the index consisted primarily, almost totally, of theological works that were outside Catholic teaching. So, faith and reason, belief and intellect are in dialogue with each other. This is what I learned through my training in grade school and high school. It was simply implicit in everything we learned. And so by the time okay, we'll just get it out of our system right away, okay? I was Jesuit educated, all right? All right? So, bada boom, whatever that means to you. But in that tradition, the academic excellence was taken for granted, as it was in many Catholic schools. The goal was to build an academic edifice that was as strong as or better than the public school system in its academic quality, and at the same time to nurture the faith. So when I got into high school, I encountered these Jesuit scholastics who were not more than 10 years older than I, but who all had master's degrees in their fields, and in addition, and all of them speak and teach Latin. The priests came back from their theological training with an additional master's degree in theology, and we even had one guy in the English department who was a retired PhD from Loyola University teaching high school English. So the academic quality was absolutely outstanding. But the Jesuits, unlike the Dominicans, who are a medieval order, the Jesuits are a Renaissance order, and so they had no problem with creating Renaissance men. It was an all-boys school, but women as well. People who could do any number of things, like Father Jim Lotze, who taught biology wonderfully, coached the swimming team to a city championship even though he couldn't swim. In fact, when they won the city championship, they threw him in the deep end of the pool and he almost drowned. Would say Mass for us regularly and occasionally drive the school bus. And so it was simply taken for granted that you could do any number of things, that you would have what I call an intellectual kind of nimbleness to undertake different areas of study. At the end of high school, as some of you know, I actually entered the Jesuit novitiate for 2 years. And in entering the novitiate, there was no sense that I was moving into an atmosphere that was antithetical to intellectual thought. The opposite were true. It was made quite clear to the novices that we were stepping into a tradition of inquiring minds who pushed the limits of our physical, social, artistic, and psychological knowledge forward. It was part of what we were taught was the Catholic tradition. Our predecessors were Dominicans like Thomas Aquinas and Albertus, who revolutionized the universities of the Middle Ages. People like Copernicus, who was a canon of the church. Other scientist priests like the 17th century Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, an early astronomer, the Augustinian friar Gregor Mendel, and in more recent times, the Jesuit priest paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin. I met priests who had been involved in the 60s in the International Geophysical Year, spending a year at the South Pole studying weather phenomena. Others were linguists and chemists and historians. And at the same time, when we encountered the theology courses, we went about them in the rigorous, logical way of Catholic theology that's dialectical, Thomistic, scholastic, in a several hundred-year-old tradition. Now, this was a time in the Catholic tradition that was also expansive and challenging and questioning. The society was undergoing a large, rapid transformation in the 60s and 70s. The novices, during the summer months, were sent away, deliberately away from the academic training. So one year I spent 6 months working as an orderly in a hospital in Cleveland, doing the most unglamorous work you can imagine in the medical field. The following summer, I was tutoring in an inner-city program in Cleveland. I worked with the Little Sisters of the Poor in an old age home, and then at the same time when I was in Cleveland, worked in a Habitat for Humanity house that the Jesuits, it wasn't Habitat for Humanity, but it was that type of project that the Jesuits were sponsoring in the inner city in Cleveland. In other words, there was no sense that we were mandarins off in the castle studying intellectual things, but we were people engaged in the world with a particular kind of contemplation and action that was fed by the spirituality of the church, centered on a prayer life that included the remarkable spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola, a 30-day silent retreat, which I could really use right now, and during which, and this is the important part, the exercises engage the imagination and the emotions in a way that mere thinking doesn't. And so after all the theology, after all the study of field, one goes into this reading of Scripture and engages what I think a Jungian analyst would call active imagination, which anchors the experience of the divine in a deep existential way, so that the theology becomes the parsing apart of the experience of the divine. Now, how does all of this work? I think this Catholic habit of mind leads to a kind of seamlessness in your life. That is to say, it's not a question of faith versus reason, but a complementarity of faith and reason. The questions and the contradictions that rattle the biblical literalists and the materialist literalists don't even come up. Models of contemplation in action or of intellection completed by spiritual contemplation were all around us in our instructors. Priests at the University of Detroit, like Father John O'Malley, who's one of the country's best Renaissance historians, would teach these brilliant classes on the Renaissance, including all the scandalous behavior of those Renaissance popes. Then he would take off his academic hat, put on the vestments, say Mass, and preach and pray with some wonderful authority and articulateness. And that movement back and forth modeled a way of living that I think is, to my mind, distinctively Catholic. It's not to say that other traditions don't do that, but not quite that way. Plus, the Catholic Church continued the long classical and Christian tradition of spiritual interpretation of Scripture known as the fourfold exegesis. And it's understood that the Scripture, in addition to its literal level, also needs to be read on deeper levels, the allegorical, and proceeding downward, the moral, and finally the anagogical level, or the level that leads to metaphysical and eschatological knowledge. The result in those traditions, including the Catholic, that kept that fourfold model of reading was a kind of nimbleness, I call it. A nimbleness of mind that I find missing in either of the fundamentalist approaches to life. In practicing this approach of fourfold reading of the same text, you learn to walk around a topic, as it were, to consider not only the surface or the literal level, but the deeper manifestations as well, the non-literal ways of meaning. So another way to talk about this, I think, is that the Catholic habit of mind, the Catholic way of moving in the world, involves a holistic approach that calls not only on the intellect and on logic and reason, but on other human faculties like imagination, emotion, the whole spectrum of psychological processes that we might label irrational. In fact, in many ways, Catholicism, especially in its ritual practice, celebrates the irrational. And I think that might be why I've had so little difficulty in my life moving into Buddhist environments or Hindu environments or singing Protestant hymns and attending other traditions at temple and so on. I feel I understand what's going on in that ritual process. The Catholic habit of mind, then, for all of the intellectual rigor that we've brought to it over the last several hundred years, continues to believe that sometimes the rational mind gets in the way. It's too easy for this rational mind, the censorious intellectual, to say, look at you, kneeling on the floor like a medieval peasant. What's wrong with you? Don't you know you've got a PhD? We shouldn't do this stuff anymore. Indeed, this seems to be the tone of those neo-atheists like Christopher Hitchens, who really don't kneel before anything but the human intellect. But the Catholic habit of mind understands that when you push logic to its absolute limit, when you push intellection as far as it can go, we sometimes simply have to let reason go, because rational thinking is only one way of comprehending the world. And as that fourfold exegesis holds, it may be the most superficial way. There are other kinds of thought, other disciplines of understanding, things that the Hindus call the yogas, the disciplines, that don't rely on reason alone. And the role of faith, I think, in a college environment is to keep the intellect humble. Because the intellect, when we construct these wonderful little paradigms where everything seems to fit statistically and everything else, we can begin to fool ourselves into thinking that this map that we've created of the world we live in is the world we live in. And it's just one representation of it. But faith is like a circle that encircles the reasonable mind, the rational mind. And it's a viewpoint outside of reason that reminds reason, importantly, that it is not running the whole show. I think this is Thomas Aquinas at the end of his life, after writing this wonderful intellectual machine, the Summa Theologica, right? Had some kind of experience of God and said after that, all my writing has been as straw, worth nothing, compared to the existential experience of the divine, that he, having written the most brilliant work of the Middle Ages, could simply let it go at some point and experiencing something else. So one of the roles on a Catholic campus of faith and reason is to remind us, importantly, that when science says, well, we may not understand this now, but if we sift enough data, if we get enough information, then we'll know everything, and faith's job is to say, no, not even then, not even then. So here we are, the crossing point. That's where we live, is the crossing point of faith and reason, I think. So by focusing for a few minutes on the irrationality of this Catholic tradition, I hope I've set the stage for discussing what I think is the real hallmark of this Catholic intellectual tradition, and why I hope that Aquinas stays Catholic, even if there aren't any Catholics here. So as I mentioned, our political discourse, our social discourse, the way the political campaign is shaping up, we seem to be arguing faith or reason, intellect or emotion, rationality or irrationality, Genesis or evolution, science or religion. It's a big attraction to living on one side or the other of the word or, right? It's life simple. People who believe in faith or reason or science or religion, I admire them because they're sure of everything. They know. They speak with confidence even when they're wrong. But the relative simplicity of this, being a main attraction for folks, is also its greatest liability. Those who decide to live by faith and reason, on the other hand, choose a more difficult way, a way that's complex and contradictory, which I believe is also the way to a fuller life, ultimately. Why do I say that? Because I think they're complementary. They complete each other. And out of the creative tension that never goes away between faith and reason, by trying to think and live two ways instead of one, we end up having a fuller life than would be possible if we followed one way only. Just like when, I'm looking through these lenses here for far distance, and I have a middle lens for reading music out here, and then I've got a bottom lens for reading up close. When I look through different lenses, I see different things. When I look through the lens of faith, I see life one way. When I look through the lens of reason, I see another way. If I put the views together, I've got something whole. The Catholic approach, I think, posits these different domains over which reason and faith have proper jurisdiction. If you think it's a difficult juggling act to maintain, you're right. It is. Because we still yearn for the one thing necessary. We want one thing necessary. We want a grand, unified theory of life. One paradigm, one approach that fit all the phenomena of human existence. But the Catholic approach, I think, is admirable in that it admits you'll never find the one thing necessary. The complexity of life won't allow for it. Human reason at some point is simply must be left behind. So let's try to explain this more by going French on you, all right? The French have a nice distinction between connaissance and savoir. Connaissance we would translate into American as book learning, okay? And connaissance is rational. It's the type of knowledge we mostly engage in the classroom. But savoir, as in the sense of savoir-faire, means to know how to do something. And the example I often use with my students is the difference between, remember learning to ride a bicycle? And your parent or somebody put you on the bike and said, now here's what you do. You grab the handlebars this way, and you pedal this way, and then you move forward, and you keep your balance by adjusting this way and that, and you get it, and you say, yeah, I understand. I got the theory, right? Okay, let's go. Blam, you fall over. Right? That's savoir. Connaissance is the theory. Savoir is, oh man, I fell off the bike. Now what? Now I get up again and again and again. And I remember when my son Will learned to ride a bike, he did that. And then there was a moment when I said, he knows. But he didn't know up here, he knew in his bones, right? I mean, you know in your body how to ride a bike. This is what savoir does. And this is what I think this attention to both faith and reason does for us. The logical understanding of connaissance combined with the savoir to know how to live one's way through life, which is as complicated riding the bicycle of life as riding any other thing. So, let's try to wrap this up a little bit. It's perfectly possible to live a life of faith or reason. And if we look at people in our time and listen to much political debate, it's possible to live a life without faith or reason, neither one. But I believe that to live an either-or life, or a neither-nor life, is really incomplete. All of us live at this crossing point of connaissance and savoir, at the meeting point where faith and reason cross each other and exist in tension. We test our faith against our reason. We test our rational answers against our faith and life experiences. If we only have the book learning, we got dry, dusty academic stuff. It's a typical fault of us, academics, that we think we can live with just book learning, that if we read enough books, our lives will sort themselves out. Bad news, it won't. It's what you learn by turning 20 for the third time, as I did last summer. On the other hand, it's the common mistake of people who want to live by faith alone that they never have to think, which is also a form of incompleteness. If you think you can ignore facts and have the one thing necessary, you're wrong. Both views are incomplete because neither one encompasses the real complexity of human existence. So where are we? Well, we're at the Christian iconography of the cross. Right across, faith and reason. We are suspended, even crucified in a sense, between life and death, between good and evil, between male and female, between up and down, between heaven and earth, between day and night. And out of the tension of those oppositions comes everything we call life. You cannot not live at the meeting point of all of those oppositions and live a full life. And it's a crucifixion because it's painful. I think the Chinese in Taoism express that through the yin-yang diagram, where the dark and the light whirl around each other in our daily life and make two basic forces that generate all of existence. So here we are. Life is too complicated for either-or thinking. So here's my humble opinion, one old white male's opinion. My deepest hope is that Aquinas College remains a place where this delicate interaction of faith and reason is maintained. Now, that being said, let me conclude with some thoughts how we might carry a dialogue forward on campus by stating my fears about the future of this place. My first fear, as we continue to lose the living tradition of the Dominican religious who've kept us alive for 125 years, is that we could become a thoroughly secular liberal arts college and lose the spiritual religious dimension that's been so much a part of our history. If we become a small liberal arts college instead of a small Catholic liberal arts college, I believe we'll have lost a unique part of our personality, of the thing that makes us who we are and who we've been. My second fear, however, is that we'll become too Catholic. And by that, I mean a way that is not in the best of the Catholic tradition and may not even be healthy. And that is, I fear that Aquinas could become like some other denominational schools that require some kind of faith test for employment, or that require all courses and all syllabi and departmental mission statements to include specific faith language. And I fear then that the intellectual life that we prize so much is going to get forced onto some kind of Procrustean bed of narrow dogmatism if we're not careful. Not only do I think that's not Catholic, but the National Council of Catholic Bishops agrees. If you read the implementation statement of 2001, the bishops talk at great length about the necessary tension between academic freedom and Catholic teaching. And they're careful to maintain the integrity of the academic disciplines. The only academic discipline that is required to have approval by the bishop is theology. Not biology, not English, not anything else. Only the theologians have to have the mandatum that says they are teaching Orthodox Catholic theology. The rest of us teach our disciplines. At the same time, the bishops say that the disciplines have to undertake dialogue with the faith of the college in a manner that is respectful, open, and listening. In other words, no Catholic bashing. We can certainly question what's wrong with the church. We can question policies of the church. But the way we do it has to be in the spirit, the old Dominican spirit of disputatio, not in a nasty way. Now, George Weigel on April 11th is going to go into some detail on ex corde and what it means, I think, at least by the title of his talk. And so I'd encourage you all to attend that. So let me wrap up here, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. Some critics of Aquinas College, mostly from the conservative camp, say Aquinas is not Catholic enough, by which they mean usually that we don't require faith tests for our faculty, staff, or students, that we don't have a preferential hiring policy for Catholics. In opposition to that, I would like to see Aquinas be Catholic enough, in a broader sense, by calling ourselves to live up to what is best in the Catholic intellectual tradition. If we can move into the future, the next 125 years, with the distinctively Catholic integration and emphasis on faith and reason, emphasizing the gospel values of service to the world, witnessing both to the power and the majesty of the human intellect, and at the same time recognizing its limits, humbly acknowledging the limits, then I think that's what I would mean by Catholic enough. And even though I'm no longer a practicing Catholic myself, I hope that the public expression of this college's life, spiritual life, continues to be Catholic, because the Catholic Church has always accepted the truth of other religions and other sects of Christianity, reserving for itself the fullest expression of truth. And I hope that in the future, the professing Catholics on campus will show the rest of us, by their example, how to weave faith and reason together as they respect without condescension those of us that are following different paths to the light. Well, this is only the beginning of what I hope will be an ongoing conversation around here. We need to have this conversation if we're going to enter the next 125 years deepening our tradition rather than turning from it. The conversation we should have in the next few years won't be easy, but I think it's going to be challenging and lively. I think it's going to be an opportunity for growth for all of us. And in two words, it will be both and. Thank you.